This color grading technique has been missing from YouTube. Now it's time to reveal it, as it's super powerful. You can add fill light in post to shadows, or add negative fill in post as well. You can recover highlight details, you can add 3-dimensional depth to your images, or you can boost your light sources, or add filmic density to skin tones. Let's learn local tone mapping. Local tone mapping is combined of local and tone mapping. To explain this, here you can see a classical illusion image that has one white square in shadow and one black square in the light. They end up having the same luminance value, but your brain thinks they are different as we are very good at figuring out the surface brightness, ignoring the local exposure. So now let me explain the concept behind local tone mapping. Tone mapping without localization is simply editing your pixels, brightness values. Basically, all exposure and contrast related modifications can be considered tone mapping, where we remap our tones. These operations are considered global, not local. Global operations happen regardless if the pixel value is high or low because of the surface value or because of the exposure of the given area, as you can see in this illusion image. But how about we could have a technique that could break the frame down to local exposure areas, and we could then edit the exposure areas independently. This is called local tone mapping. So in local tone mapping, we create luminance-based masks that affect a given tonal area, regardless of the surface values. Example, low tone, mid tone, or high tone areas. These might not sound that special, but soon you'll see the power of this technique. This clip is from Guillaume, a subscriber to the channel. And sorry, I pronounced your name probably wrong. Check out his Vimeo account in the description. So, to create a localized tonal area mask, we first select the area we want to affect. For example, the shadows. Smart way to do this is to use the HSL qualifier, as it adapts based on what is in the frame. Using the black and white mask view, we can select what we consider to be the shadows in this case. White is included in our mask, black is not. Then we feather the selection to avoid artifacts, but this is not actually localized yet, because the only parameter we use is the brightness of the pixel. To localize the mask, we need to use some kind of a blur effect. The basic blur slider can do the trick. This blur is called Gaussian blur. All pixels blur to the nearby pixels based on the distance, and this localizes the effect. But there is a better method hidden in the HSL qualifier. Instead of the Gaussian blur, we use an advanced algorithm called bilateral blur. This algorithm blurs the image similar to the normal Gaussian blur, but in addition to the distance, the difference in the brightness value of the nearby pixels are considered as well. This ends up conserving the details much better, giving us a better mask. This helps with halos. That's a common beginner issues when using this technique. And let's talk about halos a bit later. The bilateral blur is actually the denoise slider in the HSL qualifier. This makes a big difference, and now you know how to create local tone mapping masks. Select the tonal range, then add ramps, then add bilateral blur to localize the masks with the denoise slider. Here we have some practice footage, and let's color manage and color correct it quickly, as this is important for this local tone mapping to work properly. This clip is shot in log profile, so first we add an IDT node, input device transform node. Now the clip is in ACCCT color space, which is our working color space. You can use DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate as well, but I'm a ACIS fanboy. Then to make this clip look normal, we add an ODT node, output device transform node. This takes our footage to our delivery color space, Rexelon 9A, and in between the IDT and the ODT nodes, we can add a color correction node. And if you have your timeline color space set to ACCCT, then using the HDR wheel, the global wheel, we can accurately edit our white balance and our exposure. And now we have done our color management and color correction. Before I can actually show you the local tone mapping technique, let me tell you how you can help me make better videos and make you a better and a faster colorist. My ACIS Lite look library. When we have our color management done as we did a second ago, we can apply look modification transforms to our footage. These are pre-made looks that give us a professional grade, often in just one click. You can switch to another look, just like this, and there's almost 20 looks to choose from. Synthetic and real film emulation looks. And I'm adding more looks all the time that you will get right away when they are ready. I wanted to give people a shortcut on how to achieve the same quality looks as I'm able to create without spending a decade to learn how to color grade, as I did. These are much more than regular LUTs or DCTLs. These edit your colors, add physically accurate halation, physically accurate diffusion, realistic grain, and many of these include local tone mapping techniques, similar to the ones you learn in this video. And everything in these looks is parametric. You can dive inside the look node and get access to all of the sub-elements, all made with native tools. You can easily adjust the size and strength of the halation effect, or edit the diffusion nodes, change the type of film grain. You can add your own modifications or even mix and match looks together. And when you get my ACES Lite look library, you get clear and straight to the point tutorials on how to use these looks and learn this workflow easily. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and I actually reply to questions about the product and help people when they need help with their grading. To learn more about my look library and support me making these tutorials, check out the link in the description and in the end of the video. Now, let's learn how to use local tone mapping and its different applications. First, let's recover some highlight details. So here we have a scene with high dynamic range, very bright sky and very dark shadows, or relatively dark shadows. Let's color correct it. So now we see the shadows quite nicely. And let's add a look modification transform from the look library. This is the Vision 3 250D, and it gives a very filmic look with one click. Anyway, and then let's recover the highlights with the local tone mapping technique. And you can see how much detail and texture and everything we got from the sky. And if we would now try to do the same thing with normal tools, you could see, yes, we do get the detail back from the highlights, but the midtones go very flat. So if we compare it to the look modification transform, you can see how much these details, midtone details, are preserved with the local tone mapping technique. And here, let's see how I have done this. I have done this with the light slider. So I've brought the light down with the HDR wheels, light HDR wheel. I have brought that down almost 3 stops. But if we do it with the local tone mapping, it looks much better. Okay, let's extract that, and let's extract that. And let me show you how I would do it. So highlight local tone mapping. And by the way, this is a good thing to notice that I often like to use the local tone mapping before the exposure and white balance node, where we color correct our exposure, because this affects what is highlighted, what is shadow. So it's better to do it before, because then I can freely still keep on pushing the exposure up and down, and it doesn't affect the mask because it's happening before that. Okay, so let's go to the HSL secondaries. I'm gonna use the black and white view, this one here, but I have a keyboard shortcut for that. So whenever you see that this goes white, then it's just this, it's there. And now I'm gonna aim for the gap between the shadow and the highlights. So as you can see in the waveform, there's the highlight pixels, and then here are the shadow pixels, and there's a quite nice gap between them. So I'll try to aim there in this particular case, and then I'll add a bit of ramp, just a bit, something like that. And then let's add denoise. And in this case, because the gap is quite nice, we don't actually need that much. That should be okay. And now I can bring the highlights down, for example, with the global wheel. This brings the exposure down very accurately. But because we're working with local tone mapping, we can pretty much use any tool. And in many cases, the curves tool is quite nice, because with the same tool, you can work with the contrast of a tonal area and the exposure. So this mountain here in the histogram is the sky. So let's bring that down first to some level that we like. Not that much, maybe something like that. And then let's sculpt the shape so that there is contrast. and we can see the details. We could bring it even more down. That starts to look quite nice. Way too much. Okay, a bit too much. There's a bit of a delay here. Okay, so now that's before and that's after. And actually here we can start seeing something that we should address slightly. In this case, it's quite okay. But these halos, like shadow, these mid-tone areas start to have this halo around them. But let's get back to that in a bit later when we talk about mistakes. So let's move on. Then the next one is the opposite of highlight recovery. This is shadow recovery. So adding fill light to your shadows. So here, for example, we have a contrasted scene and let's color correct it. And then let's add a Cinemodern look from the look library. And it gives this very contrasted look to our frame. And now it would be nice if the shadows would not be so dark. And the best option would be, of course, to have a reflector somewhere in this, on the scene. But if we did not have that, here's a technique that you could give that similar kind of effect by adding fill light in post, so recovering shadows. And it looks very much similar to if you would have had a fill light there. And let's compare if we could do that with so-called normal tools. So let's add this to the signal path. And here I'm using the global HDR shadow wheel. Let's see, this one, yeah, that's one. 1.2 stops of exposure to the shadows. And it looks kind of similar, but take a look at the mid-tone areas here. Here, with the local tone mapping, the hair, they stay the same, but with the global non-local, you can see how the midtones were starting to lose the contrast and detail in the midtones. And that is the beauty of local tone mapping, is that you can kind of separate the areas you don't want to be affected. If you do it globally, you need to kind of push everything, but then, well, that's what we talked about in the theory part. Okay, so how do I would go about doing that? Let's do a node. Let's call it shadow local tone mapping. And go to the HSL wheels. Let's have the mask view. Let's exclude highlight areas. And because this is skin tone, I'm going to add a bit more ramp, like more softer ramp. Maybe something like that. And then denoise it. And let's, this is pretty much like, you can always push it to 100 and start there, but I would assume in this case, I think it might be somewhere better, like halfway, maybe 60. Okay, and now the way to do this, often the lift is quite good for lifting the shadows, as the name implies, not that much. Or then we could try again with the curves. So actually, if I bring this point up, that is exactly the same as the lift is doing. But here we could as well work to add a bit of contrast just to our liking, something like that. Again, with the curves, when the line is down or up, that affects the exposure, and when it's steeper or less steep, that affects the contrast of this area. And now we have this kind of a nice effect on it. I might want to adjust how far we push it, how much of the shadows. Let's put it like that. Okay, now it looks nice. And yeah, that's for the shadow recovery. Hey, it's me, Jonas from the future, and I wanted to come back and add this section to this tutorial, even though this might make things quite confusing. But I think this is important. I wanted to add this because otherwise I would feel like I'm withholding some crucial information from you guys. So I'm going to add this confusing part here. And the confusing part is that I learn new things when I'm doing these tutorials, and I just learned something new and I want to share it. Okay, so this was about the previous section, adding fill light in post. And this only applies when you're working with shadows, when you're trying to like go into the shadows and work with them. So, and that is that when you create your local tone mapping mask with the HSL secondaries, HSL qualifier, you often would go and select the right side and bring that down. So you exclude, black is excluded, white is included. You would do it like this, that you exclude the highlight area and then you add the denoise. Okay, that's how I showed you to do it just a second ago. But there's actually a better way, because now the bilateral blur doesn't quite work. It looks like Gaussian blur actually. And the better way of doing that is in the same image, and let's connect it here just in case, is actually do the opposite. So exclude the shadow areas even though that's your end goal is to actually use the do things with the black area. So exclude the shadow areas, something like this, and then add denoise. And you can already see the difference between this and this. Okay, it's inverted. The denoise apparently works only when you have it this way around. And now, because we want to actually work with the shadows, you go to the key tab and you invert the key output. You invert it here. And now this gives us much more bilateral blur mask compared to this. Even though we're using denoise here, and we're using denoise here, and the only difference is that we selected the shadows instead of the white, like we switched that, and now the bilateral blur works much better. And yeah, I just learned this while doing this. And this only applies when you're working with shadows. With the highlights is still what I said in the tutorial previously, that holds. So keep on doing that. But when you're selecting the shadows, it's actually better to select the highlights and then invert the mask in the key output, like here. Okay. Phew, okay, sorry for confusing. I just wanted to add this here. Let's go to the next part. Then let's do the opposite of shadow recovery, that is adding more shadows. So negative fill is often called. That's when on the scene you bring like a black fabric next to your subject, so it let the shadows get darker. And here we have some studio shots. Studio shot, let's color correct it. And then let's add a look. This is the Vision 3 250D from the look library. And it gives this like, almost like it, well, it's very accurate how it would look if you would have shot it with this film stock. And then here is our shadow local tone mapping that adds this like extra shadow. It adds it to the background and to the shadow side of the face as well. And if we compare it to a normal way of doing shadows, like now you can see that the shadow side is pretty much as dark, but when we do it with just normal contrast on exposure tools, for example, in this case, we are doing with the curves, the downside is that wherever we add contrast, that as well adds saturation, because contrast adds saturation, and it adds as well often like local contrast as well. So like details, for example, these like skin texture and the hair here, you can see how much more kind of like more texture there's in the hair, like not so nice texture compared to the local tone mapping. And you can see that the color and the exposure stays much more realistic with the local tone mapping than it does with the just normal contrast and exposure tools. So let me show how I would go about doing that. So let's create a node. Let's call it shadow local tone mapping again, but this time we're not recovering, we are adding more shadow. So HSL secondary, black and white view, and then let's select what we consider to be shadows. I think we could consider the whole background to be shadows, something like this. And then let's add a nice ramp because we're working with skin tones again. Something like this, and then let's denoise it, and let's add something like this. This is like up to you. You can try different versions, and then maybe in this case, just simple exposure lowering could help, and then we could play around with this on how much we want the shadow to, how far we want the shadow to reach, something like this. And now it looks very natural, like almost like I would have the black fabric there when I shot this. Then let's talk about how to add three-dimensional depth to your midtones. Well, that basically means just adding more contrast to your midtones without affecting the rest of the, like the highlights and shadows. So here we have a clip that we used before. Let's color correct it and let's add a look from the look library. This is a Cinemodern look and it gives, well, quite a nice look. But if we would really want to make this look like, I don't know, some kind of a cinematic horror, sci-fi spacecraft, it would be nice to add more this like contrast to the midtones without crushing the shadows or adding more light to the highlights. So you can see this highlight area is not affected. The shadow area there is not affected. And you can see it in the mask. And if we compare it to a normal way of just adding contrast, it gives the same kind of contrast to the midtones. The midtones look the same between the local tone mapping, but with the contrast, you can see how much darker the, wait, not that one, how much darker the shadows went, and the highlights go, they start getting brighter as well. And in this case, it kind of works, but I think in many cases, I think it kind of crushes the shadows too much if you really want to push that much contrast. So this is a nice method of kind of protecting the highlights and protecting the shadow areas. Wait, what happened here? Something interesting. Let's recap. Let's go back. Okay, now it works. Okay. I don't know what happened there. Okay. So anyway, this like protects the highlights, protects the shadows. So how I would go about doing it? Let's add a node again before the color correction node. Let's call it the midtone local tone mapping. And you don't need to name these, but I just like to name things, my nodes. And now I'm going to add exclude the shadows, and I can decide myself what is considered shadow, something like this, and then just adding a slight ramp. And then let's exclude the highlights as well. Let's add something like this. And I could add the ramp here as well. That might be easier in this case. And just fine-tuning it, what I want to consider my shadows and highlights. Okay, and then let's denoise, and this time let's just add the denoise like 100%, full denoise. And now I could just go to the contrast and add, for example, quite a lot of contrast, 3.3. Let's try even more, 3.4. And then I could actually lower the saturation a bit, maybe like this. And now I could actually just add even more contrast, 1.5, and maybe play around with the pivot. And that's like really strong, much stronger than we previously had it. Something like that. Now it's really starting to look like a bit too much. Let's dial it down, like 1.3, and then maybe add just a bit more saturation there. Okay, that's kind of nice way of adding like this three-dimensionality to skin tones. I mean midtones. But let's actually talk about skin tones next. So talking about midtones, because skin tones are often midtones, and in this case, let's talk about skin tones and how to get like cinematic density to skin tones. So here we have a clip, and let's color correct it. Let's add a look from the look library, and that gives a nice look to the image, just with one click. And then actually, I think the highlights are quite bright. So let's use the highlight recovery tool, like the technique, to bring the highlights down. And now I think the skin tones are looking kind of flat. And here is a midtone details, midtone local tone mapping, quite a mouthful, that gives this cinematic density to the skin tones. And if we would try to do the same thing with normal tools, this could be the results. And let me show you how I did that. I did it with the color slice. There's these density tools, and I boost like the red skin and yellow all the way up, and this is what I got. Maybe there's some other methods that might work better, but you don't need to learn them. I don't need to learn them because we have the local tone mapping method that really gives this like depth and dark, like density to skin tones. So okay, let me show you how I would create it. So I would of course create the midtones local tone mapping node. Then I would go to the HLSO secondaries, and I would first start by narrowing down into my skin tones. So I would add a very narrow selection here, then go about until I find my skin tones to be somewhere there. And then I would need to widen it quite a lot, maybe something like that, and then soften it. And that's quite okay. These doesn't matter because they are actually quite dark. They are not part of the midtones. And then I would go and eliminate the shadows. And I even want to eliminate the shadows on her face as well. So something like this. And then let's add a bit of a ramp, the shadow side. And then let's eliminate or like exclude the highlights as well. And I want to exclude just a bit from this highlight skin tone, like skin tone highlights, like these areas. I want to exclude those as well. Something like that. And then let's denoise. And let's denoise something like that. Maybe we'll bring the highlights down. That looks good. Okay. And it doesn't really matter that this is part of the selection because it's very close to skin tones. Okay. And then we could just add like 1.3 exposure. No, I mean contrast, maybe not that much. 1.2. And then let's play around with the pivot. Something like this, or maybe more, 1.25. And let's play around with the pivot. Pivot is basically like, because contrast is like highlights go up, shadows go down. So where is like the pivoting point? Is it higher or lower? That's what the pivot does. And now it gives much more density there. Maybe you could lower the exposure, get a bit, maybe add a bit of saturation there. And then let's see, let's try to work with, because this is possible as well. Like I can now work with the skin tones and work with the, like the, what is it? White balance of the skin tone. So maybe having a bit of warmth there, and then maybe just a bit of green, just ever so light, slightly, not that much, maybe, or maybe something like that. Okay, let's see. This is before, quite a flat, and now there's much more density to the skin tones. So that's a really nice tool to have in your toolbox as well. Okay, this is a fun one, not so useful maybe, but it's nice to know how you can do this as well. So here we have the same clip from previously, and I'm going to add a diffusion emulation to this. And diffusion, these are very accurate emulations on if you would have an actual pearlescent filter in front of your lens, this would be the case. But the issue why this isn't so strong as the real filter would be is actually that the highlights are blown out. So if I, not that one, if I do this one, you can see the no color corrections applied. You can see these highlight areas, they have clipped here. So the actual values could be and are much higher. They're much brighter, but because the camera sensor was not able to capture them, they were clipping. So the actual brightness of these light sources is unknown. And that's why when we add the pearlescent filter, it's not really kind of like giving them that kind of like strong bloom as they would if you have an actual physical filter. So we can use a local tone mapping to boost the highlight areas. And you can see if we turn this ODT off, and maybe that one off as well, you can see how much stronger the highlights go, where everything else in the waveform stays pretty much the same. And that is that's how you can make these pearlescent filters, because many of the look library looks actually have physically accurate diffusion filters in them. So if you want to make them look like they are, if you would have actually had one on set, then this highlight boosting is a good way of adding that kind of that boost there. So let me show you how I'd go about doing it. I would add a local tone mapping, so like highlight, local tone mapping. Then I would use the black and white view and just select only the brightest pixels, like only the, how would I say, the clipped pixels, just there, and add just a bit of denoise, very little denoise. And then I would go to the HDR wheel and then maybe let's add 6 stops of exposure. Well, that's too much. Okay, let's bring it down. Maybe 3 stops of exposure. That might be good. Okay, so that's boosting the highlights to have 3 stops more of exposure actually. So yeah, so that's how you can boost your highlights. Okay, let's talk about a bit of common mistakes. And then one very common mistake is that when we do this kind of like aggressive highlight recovery or shadow recovery, we end up having these halos. And let's make them stronger. So if I would, instead of the denoise slider, I would be using the blur slider. And then if I would actually have a very strong effect on this, something like this, now you can start seeing these halos there. And the first thing to avoid halos is to be less aggressive. Of course, this kind of strength on the highlight recovery, that will like almost always create some kind of halo. So let's not do it as strong. So let's try to do some kind of a compromise here by having the recovery not as strong. And then another way of reducing the strength is to, for example, this cloud here is actually quite, it's relatively dark. Of course, it's highlight, but it's kind of like the shadow side of the highlights. So we could exclude it from the selection. So if we would bring this up, you can start seeing that the cloud is not so much selected anymore. So then that's one way of like excluding the darkest parts and just play around with that. So maybe something like that could be a way of, like, we still are recovering the details in the highlights, but we are not recovering so much of the shadow side of the highlight area, if you understand what I mean. Okay, so those are simple ways of mitigating. But again, instead of using the blur radius, let's just use the denoise one. And in this case, we can just ever so slightly, like one step at a time, like see what slider amount gives us the less amount of halos. For example, just having, in this case, like the value of 10, I would say that now it's relatively unnoticeable if you don't know what to look for. But then there's other ways of doing this as well. Let's have the black and white view. And you can see this kind of like, how would I say, this fuss around these shadows. And one way to avoid halos is to just avoid that fussiness around the edges. Let's bring the white down, something like this, and then let's use the clean white slider, and this will just erode a bit of the fuzziness around those structures. And here you can see that now the haloing is minimal, but now we start to have this kind of like almost like a silhouette effect on the shadows, on the characters and all of this. And of course, again, we were using quite a strong effect here. So let's bring that up a bit to not have it so strong. And now by working with these sliders here, the clean white and then potentially clean black as well, we can start kind of like mitigate the fuzziness around the edge. And for example, this starts to look quite convincing. Like maybe there's a bit of that kind of like line still. So that's one option. And then one last option to avoid halos is to use the shrink and grow morph operation. So let me show you what does that do. So let's clean the clean black and clean white back to 0. So if we add grow, this will actually grow the white area. So if I use this, you can see how if I do a lot, you can see how it's kind of eating into the structures there. So with this, I can push the edge slightly inside. So now you can see the halo is happening like just outside of the structure. But with the morph radius, I can push it just a bit inwards. And sometimes this helps. But if I push too much, it will create the kind of silhouette effect. But somewhere in between, I might find just the right amount. And the shrink, it's kind of the same, but this will make the shadows, like the black area, I mean, the black area here to grow. So in this case, it's not really what we want. But if you're doing the other way, instead of recovering the highlights, maybe then that could work. But the only thing with this morph radius is that it's very processor intensive. So your playback will drop quite a lot if you use this. So I would go and use this as the last result. And then another thing to consider as a mistake is that when we work, for example, skin tones, and we add a lot of like contrast and a lot of mid-tone contrast, and especially like this contrast to skin tones, in this one it's not so visible, but we often end up like accentuating, like exaggerating the texture of the skin as well. I had this one clip, this one, I think this might be better. So this one, so let's add like a local tone mapping here. Okay, so now we have added this local tone mapping to the mid-tone areas. And you can see how like smoother the skin looks without it. And then with it, the textures start to show up much more. And there is a way of like trying to mitigate that. And that is this tool, mid-tone details. And this is really handy for like softening the texture on skin tones. So we'll just remove something like this. Let's actually turn it on. So maybe minus 35 or something. And now it's adding the contrast to the midtones but it's not adding the texture, because local contrast and global contrast are, well, very maybe it's outside of this tutorial, but when you add contrast, you as well add the texture of on surfaces, like the skin tone wrinkles and like the texture on skins. So this removes the local contrast, or potentially adds it if you push it the other way around, as you can see there. So with this, you can add or remove texture from the skin or elsewhere if you want, when you add local tone mapping and contrast, because that will add the texture as well. So with this tool, with this node, we added contrast and texture, and with this tool, we took the added texture back away. So that's like an easy way, because often if you just add a lot of mid-tone details to your skin tones, your client will say like, "Ooh, I don't like the skin looks kind of like too sharp." So that's a way of doing that. Next, go and check out my look library product, and then add this local tone mapping technique to your toolbox as well. Here's a link for the look library product, and here's another video as well you might like. Okay, thank you.